Cheryl was born in Toronto, spent her youth in Thornhill, and now lives in Bracebridge with her husband, Randy, and two cats, Gus and Fog. Love the names of your animals. Her sons, Evan and Brody, reside in Dallas, Texas, and work in Los Angeles. She holds degrees in English and education from Queen's University. Cheryl is a former teacher of the deaf and acquisitions editor for both Blue Butterfly Books and Muskoka Books. She is presently a director of the Children's Foundation of Muskoka. Cheryl's articles and stories have appeared in numerous Canadian periodicals, and in 2010, she made her book publishing debut with Come Looking for Me, a work of historical fiction set on the high seas during the War of 1812. She completed its first draft in 2004 Huntsville Festival of the Arts Muskoka Novel Marathon and earned top honors from the panel of judges. After several more years of research, her greatly expanded and refined novel was published by Blue Butterfly Books. Her second and third novels, Second Summer of War and Run Red with Blood, were published by Dundurn Press in 2014 and 18 respectively. All three of her works are part of the Seasons of War series. When Cheryl is not at her desk writing, she is on the road speaking, addressing various clubs and organizations on the historical backdrop of her books. In her spare time, she enjoys journaling, sketching landscapes, reading fiction, traveling, and spending time at her cottage on Browning Island, Lake Muskoka. She and her husband have recently purchased a new home in Dallas to be closer to their two sons, and indeed are spending the current 6 months in Dallas, and she is broadcasting from there today. Please give Cheryl a warm Shellback welcome.
Thank you. Greetings all. Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you for inviting me into the Shellback's Zoom room this morning on this fine December day. Now, I say fine because it's quite nice down here. I have been hearing some absolute horror stories of snowstorms up your way. I don't know if Toronto's been hit, but my hometown is Bracebridge and Muskoka, and I know that they've had quite a bit of snow and ice up that way. How wonderful to be addressing a group that love sailing lore and singing sea shanties. I was kind of hoping for Can of Grog, because that's one of my favorites. I didn't know that one, but anyway, thank you. And I also want to thank Diane and Graham for the preparation for today. I'm usually very comfortable and very happy to present in person, as my talk is very interactive, and I'm still relatively new to this format. So I do thank Graham and Diane for all their prep ahead of time. So let's start in. I'll start with a little bit on my crazy writing start. So I began writing in grade 4. And for some reason, all of my stories were set on uninhabited islands. And my characters were the movie stars and models whose pictures I'd found and clipped from movies like 17 and Glamour and Tiger Beat magazines. And then at the ripe old age of 11, I received my first writing credit. My grade 6 teacher, Mrs. Lambert, had greatly admired a novella that I'd written in my spare time. And she subsequently had encouraged me to become a writer. Now, in looking back, I do suspect that her admiration sprang from the fact that she had never before taught a student with the motivation to fill up 40 pages of words when it was not a required school assignment. And it didn't matter that my main male character was Donny Osmond. There was a great deal of fanfare in my classes. Mrs. Lambert handed my novella over to Mrs. Snedker, the school secretary, and Mrs. Snedker typed it up on ditto paper and printed off several copies. And copies of my little book were placed in the library at Bayview Glen Public School for several years. Diane, do you recognize that school?
It was my school when I was an itinerant behavioral teacher in York Region.
Oh my goodness. You might have met Mrs. Lambert at some point. But anyway, so my little books did remain in the library there for a number of years until the time came when the front covers had curled and the staples holding the pages together had either rusted or fallen away. Nevertheless, my first publishing experience was very exciting, as my maternal grandfather, a writer himself, had given me, in recognition of my feat, a letter of literary support and encouragement and a $1 bill. So fast forward to high school, where I recall my life started to accelerate. Before I knew it, graduation was on the horizon, university was looming ahead of me. And it's that time when everyone starts to ask you, well, what do you want to be? So I wanted to be a writer, but I was painfully aware that my talent was about this big. So my parents packed me up and they sent me off to Queen's University, where I studied English. And I remember feeling really kind of depressed, having to read and analyze and write essays on the literary masterpieces of Dickens and Austen and the Bronte sisters. Nevertheless, sorry, I just have to ask you, is that sound in the back bothering you at all? Can you hear it?
It's okay.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, my desire to write my own fiction was so strong that I pressed on. At 27, I had finished the first draft of a novel I called Blueberry Hill. Now, thinking that I had created a masterpiece on the same level as Dickens, Austen, and the Bronte sisters, I sent it to a writer in residence at the Richmond Hill Public Library. And after he'd read it and he gave me a call, we set up a time to meet. And oh man, I still remember that bus ride up Yonge Street. And I was very nervous, but I just knew I could hear him say, he was going to say, Cheryl, every publisher in Canada will be clamoring for your work. It has the smell of a bestseller. So I arrived at his office and was asked to sit down, and without mincing his words, he came out and told me that my manuscript was truly horrible.
Oh.
Cheryl, he said, there's no conflict in your story. There's no tension between your characters. Your dialogue is banal. I didn't even know what that word meant. And your main female character is a snorer. I fell asleep on the 3rd page. So this wasn't what I was expecting to hear. I managed to somehow get through the rest of the meeting. And when I got home, I will admit, I locked myself into my bedroom and I cried. I wept for 3 days. That was it, I told myself. That was the end of my writing career that had really not even started in the first place. I was going to give up writing. It was just a big waste of time. Problem was, I couldn't give up writing. I loved writing as much as I love chocolate chip cookies. Both were addictions. If I was going to give up writing, I might as well stop breathing. So after 3 days, I pulled myself together and I went back to work on my writing. And I worked really hard to become my own toughest critic. And I tried to keep in mind the feedback that this writer in residence had given to me, as hard as it was to take initially. And when I was ready to start sending out stories again, And the rejection letters, naturally started rolling back my way. I refused to get depressed or put off. I ended up sending those stories out again, or I sat down to write something completely new and different. Now, if someone had said to me several years ago, I would one day write a series of books set on the high seas during the War of 1812, my reply most likely would have been, "You've got to be kidding." Why? Well, for starters, I was never really interested in the War of 1812. I mean, my interest has been a very recent one. So when I go back to the early days of public school, there was such a focus in my history classes, there was such a focus on American history. And if my teachers did teach Canadian history, this was just my experience, they often did so, they kind of breezed over it. And if they did mention the War of 1812, what I do recall is they did so without any enthusiasm. They maybe focused on the victories of Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh and the heroism of Laura Secord, which was fine, but it didn't in any way seize my imagination. And secondly, I had never been I'd never sailed, or I'd never been on a sailing ship, with the exception of a Carnival cruise liner, and I don't think you can count that. And the only sea vessel that I knew anything about was the rowboat at our little cottage in Muskoka. But all that changed a few years back, actually in 2004, after seeing a movie called Master and Commander. Now, I wish I could see all of you right now, but of those of you I can see, have any of you seen the movie Master and Commander? Probably all of you, right?
Yeah.
Okay, for those of you who haven't seen Master and Commander, it was set almost entirely on sea, other than a stop at the Galapagos Islands, but it was set at sea in April 1805, 6 months before the British Royal Navy, under the leadership of Horatio Nelson, defeated the French and Spanish navies at the Battle of Trafalgar. If you can believe it, I have seen Master and Commander 50 times. And it's not because of its all male cast and the fact that actor Russell Crowe had the lead role. He was pretty good as Captain Aubrey. Anyway, my fascination for this movie led to an overall fascination for the British Royal Navy and the stories of the men who lived and fought for their country on board warships and privateers and merchantmen during the Age of Sail, on what you all know were nothing more than floating islands of oak timbers and canvas, forever at the mercy of Mother Nature and her capricious winds. So this newfound interest of mine marked a number of research journeys that I ended up taking, and will hopefully continue to take once, fingers crossed, COVID is a thing of the past. So I started out in Halifax, and in Halifax, I ended up trying to visit as many of her maritime museums as possible. I had an opportunity next to go down to Charleston, South Carolina. In my first book, there are a few scenes set in Charleston, so I was anxious to see her famous harbor. I wanted to visit her famous old forts. And I also just wanted to kind of take some time to wander around the old parts of the city, wander along the cobblestones where generations of sailors had once tread. Then luckily, my husband had a conference in San Diego. I jumped on the plane with him because sitting in her harbor there is HMS Surprise, the frigate upon which the movie Master and Commander had been filmed. So that was really exciting. And then I ended up taking what I call a pilgrimage to Portsmouth, England. Again, I'm sure every one of you know the importance of Portsmouth. That is where Horatio Nelson's Victory is lying in dry dock there. So that was so exciting at the historic properties. And I'd love to know how many of you have either been to Portsmouth or have been there. Patrick O'Brien, well, I know Patrick O'Brien, I knew that you would have been there, but also, has anyone been there since 2013 when they opened the Mary Rose Museum? Mary Rose was the ship that sank in 1545 in the waters of the Solent, and they raised her from the seabed. Fabulous, fabulous museum right there with the Victory. Anyway, so it was around this time that I discovered a new way of traveling, and it's called cruising. And I'm sure amongst you, there are many of you who really enjoy cruising, or again, did pre-COVID anyway. And so I had to beg my husband, would you take me on a transatlantic cruise? Because I really need to have the experience of a true sailor, like your poor friends that are stuck out in the middle there now. But I wanted the experience of a true sailor. So we ended up taking this Fort Lauderdale to Lisbon, Portugal trip. And I absolutely loved being out in the middle of the Atlantic for 5 days in the middle of nowhere. Don't even recall seeing any passing ships. But I have to admit, I was not on a ship of timber powered by wind. The Emerald Princess was about as big as Manhattan, New York City, thereabouts. But that suited me just fine, because whenever the seas were running high, she didn't even rock or roll. She was steady. That really suited me well. I know that had I been alive 200 years ago and had to travel by sea, I am convinced that I would have been one of the poor souls confined to her hammock and being force-fed salted beef and mustard to stave off the seasickness. Now, salted beef and mustard, I read about this in Elizabeth Simcoe's diary. You, of course, all know that Elizabeth Simcoe was the husband of John Graves Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And in 1791, Elizabeth journeyed from Plymouth, England to Upper Canada on a fairly small ship, and it took her 46 days. And when she was seasick, that's what she had, salt beef and mustard. 5 days at sea was great. 46 days, I'm not sure I would have been able to handle that. Would have been quite trying. So here I was. Oh, also her diaries, if you haven't, her diary is a fascinating, fascinating read. So here I was with a passion for maritime history in the British Royal Navy, and I enjoyed cruising. But what I really wanted to do was write novels set on the Atlantic Ocean. So trips aside, I knew that if I was ever going to achieve this goal, I had a lot of research and study ahead of me. So I started with the fun stuff. I started with fiction. And I reread all of Jane Austen's major works to get the feel of the language and the feel and the etiquette of the era. And I read several of Patrick O'Brien's novels. Patrick O'Brien, of course, I'm sure most of you know of him or have read many of his books. He was the creator of the Master and Commander series, and he has been called the greatest historical novelist of all time. And I also focused on another author, Captain Frederick Marryat. And very interestingly, Captain Marryat served in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. And when he retired, he wrote several exceedingly amusing naval novels. So again, if I could see you all, I'd love to know how many of you are avid readers of Patrick O'Brien. And I'd also love to know, Patrick O'Brien, I knew that you would be. And I'd also love to know, before today, had anyone ever heard the name Captain Frederick Marryat?
No.
I wouldn't be surprised within your group, but I have to tell you, all of my talks, there's maybe been one or two people that have ever heard the name Captain Frederick Marriott. Anyway, Captain Marriott was the one who coined the expression 6 of one, half dozen of the other. He also coined the expression shiver me timbers, which I had always attributed to Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island and Kidnapped. No, it was Captain Marriott. So next I tackled nonfiction, and I'm of course still tackling nonfiction. And my writing desk at home in Muskoka sits in an absolute fortress of books. And on the slideshow, there is a picture. I did include a picture of it, so be on the lookout for it. I don't know how I keep things organized. Somehow it manages. But I have a huge library of books on the British Royal Navy, sailing ships, shipwrecks, the Naval War of 1812, books on surgery and medicine, Jane Austen biographies and companions, naval lexicons, naval memoirs, and so on and so on. And let me tell you, the research, there's my lovely office at home. The research is just, it's never ending, but this is what I've really enjoyed about this writing journey, learning bit by bit about life on these great old ships. So the men on these ships were all ages, old, young, every age in between. There were always young boys on ships, many of whom were orphans that had been taken from the streets of London and other large centers around England and Scotland. And it was their job for many of them during a battle to run down to the hold and carry the powder cartridges up for the guns. They called them powder monkeys. And there were always older men on board. Now, most of these men had already had an illustrious naval career, but that might have been simply the age they were at. They were no longer able to scramble up the shrouds, or perhaps a debilitating wound that they'd received. So at this point in their career, they were maybe a cook's mate. If they had the skill, maybe they were a shoemaker, or maybe they were a servant to one of the officers. So each one of these ships was like a world unto itself, with the captain in command like a king in his country. And the captain, of course, having a hierarchy of men beneath him, from his senior and junior officers, his marines, his surgeons, his pursers, his stewards, his sailmakers, all the way down the ladder to the ordinary sailors and landmen or landsmen. Either way is acceptable. And landsmen were men that had no formal naval training, but they had a certain skill that was needed on the ship. Regardless of where they sat, their position on this hierarchy, these men led a brutal and very precarious existence. These ships were crowded, very, very crowded, as you can see from that picture right there. Very crowded. There was very little privacy to be had really anywhere other than the captain and some of his officers, but for most of the men, there was no privacy. The workday was a long, back-breaking one. Many of the men suffered back injuries, hernias, and what have you. And discipline was very, very harsh, and often doled out with a whip called a cat of nine tails. And the food they received every day was, by our standards, pretty lousy. So the Siemens Diet consisted mainly of oatmeal, salted beef or salted meat, jelly pea soup, and biscuit that was usually crawling with weevils and black-headed maggots. Now, the men didn't mind downing their biscuit in the dark because they didn't really want to see what else was burrowing in the biscuit. But they did say there are many accounts and diaries that apparently weevils are quite bitter tasting, and black-headed maggots are cold and fat tasting. So there you go. Maybe it added a little extra protein to their diet. They also received on certain days a ration of cheese. Now you can only imagine that on very, very long cruises and in the days before refrigeration, that the cheese after a while became very hard and very smelly. So the men, rather than eat their cheese ration, they would carve buttons out of it for their jackets, which I thought was a hoot. However, they did receive 3 square meals a day. And this is key because for most of these men, before they joined the Navy or they were forced or pressed into the Navy, they had been starving. So the origins of the expression that we use, 3 squares a day, 3 square meals a day, that comes from the fact that the men ate their meals off of square wooden plates. They're 3 squares a day. The prospect of a shipwreck or a fire on board was a daily concern. Now, interesting to note here that death by drowning, which often than not was the result of a shipwreck or a fire on board, was actually the 2nd greatest killer of men on the sea in this period of history. The 3rd greatest killer was death in enemy action. So anyone want to guess what number 1 was?
Don't know.
Disease.
Yeah.
Scurvy.
Disease tied for first place with accident, personal accident, like being crushed by a cannon or falling from the yards and hitting the deck. I was astounded at how many accounts of ships there were that were decimated by, the crew was decimated by an outbreak of yellow fever or typhus or scurvy. And of course, we all know, I know the Shellbacks know that it wasn't until around 1791 that they finally determined that if they added citrus fruit, lemons, limes to their diet, that they could control the scurvy. And of course, thus we have our expression limeys. Although apparently from the reading I've done, lemons did a little better job than the limes. Limey sounds better than lemonies, I guess. Anyway, when the men did have the misfortune of falling ill or being injured in battle, their only hope was the ship's surgeon. Now, the ship's surgeon often had no more skill than a common butcher. And in order to do his miserable work, he really had nothing beyond a chest full of knives and saws, a drug called laudanum, a cupboard of useless tonics, and bottles of rum. Now, many of these Royal Navy ships in this period of time didn't even have a surgeon on board at all. And those that did often had one that really had no interest in the health of the men. They avoided the hospital, the cockpit, the sick bay, as much as possible. They really weren't interested in the health of the men. And sadly, more of them were more interested in the bottles of medicinal rum. And they would be drinking up these bottles of rum rather than sharing it with the poor injured sailor whose gangrenous arm or leg was about to be lopped off. So that was pretty tough. In the movie Master and Commander, they had a very good doctor. They were very, very lucky. The really sad thing was when the Royal Navy ship stopped in port, very few of the men were allowed to get off. Do you know why? Desertion. Desertion was rife in the Royal Navy in this period of history. And this was so hard for the men because for so many of them, they had been at sea for months on end without respite. So it was tough. Those that were lucky enough to be granted shore leave, they went straight to the brothels and taverns and spent all their hard-earned shillings on women and ale. Those that actually would come back to the ship, they were poor, obviously, having lost all their money, but they were very happy for a time. So, but that was just very difficult. Their one little pleasure was their ration of grog, which they received twice a day, 6 hours apart. I don't have to ask you what grog is. I'm just wondering, do you have a little bit of that with your luncheons?
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. There you go. Okay. So, of course, by Royal Navy standards, watered down rum to which they would add the juice of lemons and limes or whatever they had on hand in order to control scurvy. Now, there were always sailors that were able to get their hands on more than their two daily rations. And this often led to bad behavior and also the expression that we now use, which is, I'm feeling rather groggy. So I think we've probably all maybe used that expression at some point before. So what I found fascinating is the word grog. Where did the word grog hail from? Fascinating if you don't know this story. So there was once an Admiral Edward Vernon in the Royal Navy. He died way back in 1757. And Admiral Vernon was known for two things. He always wore a cloak of grogram cloth, which is like a coarse wool. And he was the one who watered down the men's rum rations to make them less intoxicating. So the men called him Old Grog. And to show their disdain for his watered down rum rations, they called the watered down rum grog. A little historical note here, George Washington's home on the Potomac River in Virginia, as you know, is called Mount Vernon. And it was named by George Washington's half-brother, Lawrence, who had served in the Royal Navy under Admiral Vernon, Old Grog himself. One thing I found of particular interest was the fact that sometimes women were allowed on board warships. This, of course, was good news because there are a few female characters in my books. Naval rules dictated that once at sea, that women and prostitutes had to be left on shore. However, sometimes a captain or one of his officers was traveling with his wife. And there are documented cases of this, which I found fabulous, that sometimes women, whether in search of adventure or in desperation, they ended up disguising themselves as a man, joining a ship's company, and working alongside with the sailors. Now, in these crowded conditions, I don't know how these women would have been able to keep their identity secret, but interesting, in some cases, they did. And regardless of whether they were an officer's wife or they were in disguise, they had to withstand the same hardships as the men. And if faced with the enemy, they had to either go into hiding in the ship's hold or be able to wield a pistol or a sword or risk perishing. So then once I got to a point where I felt that I had a pretty good understanding of what life was like on the sea 200 years ago, and my storyline started to take shape, it was at this point that I decided to set my story during the War of 1812. Now, knowing my early impressions of this war, you might kind of be curious as to why. Well, first of all, I've always loved the era in which Jane Austen wrote her stories. And secondly, being inspired by this movie, Master and Commander. But I wanted a connection with Canada. And when I learned that the War of 1812 had been fought not only on the Canadian-American frontier, on the Great Lakes, on the St. Lawrence, in the American South, along the eastern seaboard, when I learned that there were hundreds of encounters on the Atlantic Ocean, and that the conditions and hardships depicted in this movie, Master and Commander, that I was besotted with, had been the experience of our own Canadian ancestors at sea, this war, the War of 1812, met all of my imaginary criteria. And while delving into research, I found, wow, this really was a fascinating war in a fascinating period of history. And I also learned that, people that I spoke to in those early years, not many of them really knew much about the War of 1812. It's often been referred to as the obscure war. And of course, there are a number of reasons why. But not long after book number 1 came out, I was asked to speak to a class of grade 12 students in my hometown. And on this present day, there were 25 students and 2 teachers in the class before me. So it was the very first time I asked them about my audience about the War of 1812. I wanted to know, okay, guys, you're almost finished high school, you're heading out into the world. How many of you actually learned about the War of 1812 during your time in school? Well, of those 25 students, only 1 raised their hand. 1, that was it. So I gave them a fun little War of 1812 quiz, and I'd like to give you the same little quiz. It's really fun, it's nothing. I don't want any stressing. You probably know all the answers and more. You can teach me about the War of 1812. But I want you to know that before I began my research, I could only answer one of the following with any kind of confidence. So Diane and Graham, I'm just wondering, is it possible, can people write answers?
I think they can in the chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, in the
Okay,
chat.
will that come up for me?
Yeah, if you click on chat, yes.
Click on chat at the bottom.
Okay, chat. There it is. Okay, so I can see a little bar there. Okay, so let's just have a little bit of fun and just throw the answers out here. So, no, first of all, I have to know, are there any 1812 historians among you? Because this is really never fun when someone knows everything about the War of 1812. Okay, anyway, who was fighting whom during this war? Anyone want to take a guess?
British versus the Americans?
British versus the Americans, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah, yes, okay, so, and the British being the British Empire. So Americans versus the British Empire. The British Empire, as you all know at this time, consisted of those who lived in Canada, English-speaking, French-speaking, First Nations, and loyalists that had come up during and after the American Revolution, right? Thank you, awesome. Okay, who was the president of the United States during this war? Anyone want to take a guess?
Washington.
No.
Oh.
His
Yeah,
wife.
appreciate if you put the answers in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. Yes, is that from you, Graham? Madison.
Mhm.
Madison. James Madison. I think his wife, Dolly, was a little bit more popular than James Madison. He was not a popular president. Who was on England's throne during this war?
Huh.
King James? Anyone else want to take it? George the okay, we've got a War of 1812 historian. His name is Edward Graham Dougal. Okay, Yes, yes, yes to Patrick O'Brien and yes to Graham. So it was George III who was still king, basically, but by 1811, after the death of his youngest daughter, he became completely mad and was unable to reign. So his eldest son, the Prince Regent, who became George IV, was basically calling the shots. Okay, well done. Okay, the war began in June of 1812. When did it officially end? I hope no one's Googling, because I wouldn't know if you are. 1814 says Marilyn and Wayne. 1815 says Bill McNaughton. 2014 says Elsbeth. Okay, here's the scoop. The Treaty of Ghent was signed Christmas Eve, 1814. But imagine 200 years ago when they had no cell phones and no computers, the men on the fronts at sea, fighting on land, they didn't hear about it until January of 1815. So the Treaty of Ghent wasn't actually ratified until February 17th, 1815. Who is the hero of the Battle of New Orleans?
No idea.
This is the only thing that I remember from my early teachings, my early learning of the War of 1812. The only thing I remember. Yes, Noel. Yes, Andrew Jackson, who later became the 7th president of the United States. Well done, Noel. What very famous building was burned during this war? I know you're all going to know this one. Right on. And I have to be honest with you, before I began my research, for some reason I always thought that had been burned during the American Revolution. So man, oh man, White House, that's right. Thank you, William and George and Jose, Marie, thank you. Okay, what very famous song was composed during this war? Anyone want to take a stab at that one? Anyone keen to try it? I have to run to another Zoom. Oh, okay. Bye, Shane. All right. So thank you, Captain Paul. The Star-Spangled Banner. The Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer and an amateur poet. And he composed it after witnessing the bombardment of Fort McHenry in the Chesapeake Bay in 1814. What I always found interesting is that he set the words to the tune of an 18th century drinking song. Did you know that? Did anyone ever hear that? Oh, did you know that, Graham? Wonderful. Okay. Here's one more, no Googling. Does anyone know when the Star-Spangled Banner actually became the American national anthem? I have to tell you, I've only come across one person who knew the year, and I thought, whoa. I, of course, had to look it up. It was an English drinking song. Okay, Graham, you are, there we have a veritable historian. Okay, I'm going to just tell you, 1931. So it was very popular when it first came out, but it did not become the American national anthem until 1931. Okay, and of always the fun one, who won the war? Anyone want to take a guess? The Brits.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Marilyn and Wayne say the Brits. Brits. Okay. No one's saying the Americans? Okay. Here's the fun one. Oh, my My battery is running low. How could my battery be running low? Hold on just a sec.
Log it in.
Don't know why it's not in. Hold on. Hold on. Man. Okay, nobody. Tom Alton, George Hume. Answer based on the side we're on. Right on. Okay, so this is the war ended in a draw. There was no clear victory. Any occupied lands were all given back at the end of the war. So again, it ended in a draw. But what I found fun was whenever I would ask a Canadian, they would always say, we did. Whenever I asked an American, and I do happen to know a lot of Americans, they would say, well, we won. And perhaps because the Battle of New Orleans was so late in the war, and it was a definitive win, but not the entire war. And then Patrick O'Brien, I'm sorry, I have to tell you, I do know a lot of British people. I've met a lot on these cruises. And when I've asked them, quite a few of them have looked at me and said, wait a sec, did we even fight in the War of 1812? They were much more, they remember fighting the French, maybe not the Americans quite so much, right? And the big question, and I'll just address this one, is why this war was fought. Okay, so there were many reasons why the War of 1812 came about. One of the reasons was the fact that many Americans wanted more farmland, and they believed they could secure it by invading Canada, which, as far as Thomas Jefferson, the third president before James Madison, in his view, invading Canada was just a mere matter of marching, which of course it didn't turn out that way. But the main reason was the desire to fight for free trade and sailors' rights. Free trade and sailors' rights. So here's the scoop. Britain had been at war with France almost continually since 1793. And the British Royal Navy was so busy trying to blockade French ports, chasing French ships on the sea, that unencumbered, the Americans picked up the slack. The Americans were trading wherever they wanted to without any obstacle. And in doing so, they were becoming hugely wealthy. Some historians believe that the British were envious of the Americans' newfound commercial prosperity. And furthermore, with all their years of warring, the British were suffering from a shortage of able-bodied men. So the British began halting and boarding American merchantmen, American merchant ships. And the first thing they would do is ask the captain or the commander if they were carrying any supplies for France, because if they were, then they were automatically deemed an enemy. But more significantly, the British would look over these crews on these American ships. They would pick out the healthy, hardy-looking men, and they would claim that they were Englishmen and therefore a deserter. And then they would take them from the American ships and put them to work on their own British ships. This practice was called impressment. And it so angered the United States, many believe this was the main reason why they went to war, to put an end to it. The truth was that there were thousands of Royal Navy deserters working in the American Navy. Why? Better conditions, newer ships, better pay, better food. Rules were less strict. And because desertion was not a problem.
Oops.
Uh-oh.
I think we just lost our speaker.
We will carry on here then with a mighty thank you. It has been absolutely fascinating. The whole, both how she started writing, and it speaks to getting started when you're in grade school, but her persistence in doing the research, and then all of the interesting facts that she came up with. I personally have very much enjoyed this representation, and I will be sending her a token of our appreciation and a letter of thanks. And so even though she's not here, let's give her a round of applause, because she may be able to go on and take a look at it afterwards. And so that brings us to next time, which will be January the 5th. So I want to wish all of you just a wonderful, safe, healthy holiday. And thank all of you for being here and being so supportive. I have appreciated everything, that all the little emails and thank yous that people have sent to me, and also the suggestions you have sent. We're going to be starting with a video, and at this point, I'm not sure which one. I have been doing quite a lot of searching the internet for the various pieces that are available. We may start with the Erebus, but let me just tell you some of the things that I have found. Sailing alone across an ocean in a 30-foot sailboat and losing a rudder 1,000 miles from Hawaii. And that's with a sailor by the name of Sailor James. And then there's a Hawaii 2021 inside single-handed sailing with Christian Williams. I have found something on Captain James Cook. I've found something on building the Titanic. Several videos about Magellan, the mysterious disappearance of a sea pioneer, and that's Joshua Slocum. And we have had a Slocum story before. And the first men to cross oceans setting sail. It's a documentary from a site called Timeline, and I think this is out of Britain. So those are just a few of the possibles that we've got coming up. In addition to other places that I'm exploring, Wes Oleszewski is going to come in with Great Lake Freighters and talk about that. Kevin Firth will be talking about the Ocean Ranger disaster. I'm going to try and get a hold of Danielle Doggett again to give us an update on the SEBA that they're building in Costa Rica. I've asked Alex Preston to come and speak to us again about his Antarctic trip. So a lot of possibles. I'm looking at the Canadian Canoe Museum, which is moving to a new space. And so we're hoping to be able to do that. I see, Maria, are you familiar with that? Yeah, you're muted.
I went there last summer.
Excellent. Yes. So I'd like to get Amanda Slade, who inspects cruise ships. And I think that would be very interesting because of what's happened with COVID. I'm also in touch with Cork, and we'll get an update on that. So although I haven't firmed up a lot of these, I think we'll have an exciting January, February, March, April coming up. So again, I thank you all for all of the support that you've given over the year. I'd like to give you my round of applause for being here and being so supportive of Shellbacks. And with that,
No, before Jim's got his hand up. Jim, you want to make?
Yes.
Yes, I can contribute a little bit of history to the War of 1812. One of my skeletons is I went to West Point for a year and a half. And the exhibit there of a chain which was strung across the Hudson River to prevent ships from coming up the river. And I have had a sailboat for many years on Lake Champlain. And when skinny dipping off Valcour Island, where there are cannonballs remaining from one of the wars, from the battles there. And
So are you saying you'd be willing to give a presentation about all of that?
well, that's really all I have.
Okay, okay, we'll talk, Jim, we'll talk.
I got something I'd like to show you. I don't even have a.
Okay, again, if you want to speak, please raise your hand and we'll take you in order.
I have one more comment. The
Okay, Jim.
Cheryl's books are on Kindle and you can download them on Kindle. I looked.
Oh, thank you, Jim. That's good to
That
know.
was a marvelous day. And I only got one question right from quiz.
Yeah, it was-
Half a question, because it was really the pirates that rescued Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans. And that's in the talk that I gave a couple of years ago about good and evil in the human brain. End of
Oh,
comment.
right,
Marvelous
right,
day.
Right.
Okay, Noel has raised his hand. Go ahead, Noel.
Michael, go to reactions and you can figure out.
Yeah,
how
I was just going to ask what the name of her books were.
She did give us those names and I don't have them right here, but I'll send them out to you.
Okay, thanks. And I had a question for everybody. Does everybody know why the White House is called the White House?
Because it was painted white after it was burnt, after the burning, like the burn.
Yeah, prior
The
to
charge?
that, it was just the House of whatever house it was. And then Dolly Madison, when Madison got elected, was having the party, and they couldn't have a party in a
Oh,
burnt old house, so they painted it white. And ever
Cheryl
since, it's been the White House.
Cheryl is back on.
Oh,
Oh,
hey, great.
Oh, good.
Okay, Cheryl.
I am so sorry. It wasn't the internet, it was a circuit breaker. Boom.
Oh,
So I'm glad you couldn't hear me because the language was not very nice.
we're not seeing you
Did you
now.
want me to finish up or do you want to just chat?
Well, we have been chatting and what I would like to do is to thank you personally.
Oh, you
I
can't see
have-
me? I can see all of you.
I can't see you. I don't know what's happened to you there. Do you have your video on? I guess that's what you need to look at the bottom left corner of your screen.
There is a picture of her.
It depends.
I can,
Yeah, guys, it will take care of the problem.
okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Absolutely, Cheryl, you have given us just such an interesting view of that whole war and also of your journey to writing. And I thank you for that. As an educator, it was fascinating for me. And of course, because you went to Bayview Glen School, which I sort of sat right up there when I heard that. Did you know Bill Jones? He was the principal there when I was there. Oh, have we lost you, Cheryl?
No, it's okay.
Oh, you're just,
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
did you hear my
Okay,
question?
Bill Jones, I'm sorry, Diane, I clicked off again.
Bill Jones was the
Was the question Bill Jones, the
He was the principal when I was there.
principal at Bayview Glen?
Yeah.
No, the principals that I remember were Stanley Myers
Didn't know.
and Mr. Stover.
Okay, no, I didn't. That was just a personal question that
No.
has really nothing to do with anything.
But it was kind of interesting because there was one talk that yeah. Right.
So Cheryl, are you willing, if you're interested, we can.
Well, I'm really sorry I didn't get to the fun part. The fun
Oh.
part was talking about word. Yes.
Okay, well, for those of us, I'm willing to stay and listen. So how much more time are you thinking of?
Do you want me to come back another time? I'll come back another time.
Okay, that would be, we'll talk. Absolutely. We'll talk about it.
Okay,
Terrific.
whatever works for you.
Well, I would guess I was just asking how much more time were you thinking of with this?
Well, it probably won't take too long. Had just finished up. We were just going to get into the fun stuff about the words and expressions, which I always, this is the best part of the talk. but it's okay. I am so sorry for the interruption. If you want me to do it another time, that would be fine.
Well, that's a possibility. I'm certainly willing to stick around if you want to do it now, because I think it would be kind of fun. But I'm not sure how many will stay because, well, we don't have a lot of people leaving here. So go ahead, Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah. Do it instead of chat room.
Okay. So, okay, good to go?
Good to
Yeah,
go.
go ahead.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So I just wanted to finish up that the last little bit, I think about the whole impressment bit in the War of 1812. I had just said that we're working in the American Navy because the conditions were great, the food was great, the ships were newer, the rules were less strict. At the same time, of legitimate sailors that had once been a British subject, that were of British descent, and they were working in the American Navy, but they weren't deserters in the British Royal Navy. So what ended up happening is so many men were, as a result, taken in error. And thus the major reason for the conflict. So just to wrap up, and again, I am so sorry about that. I don't think I've ever done a Zoom where something doesn't crash at some point. Anyway, while researching,
We're having difficulty here, Cheryl. I don't know what's happened with the connection. Graham, do you?
I think there is a problem with her internet connection.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, we're going to have to bring her back, and we'll do that when we have a short video. We can ask her to come back for 10 or 15 minutes to go through some of these expressions that she has. So Graham, if you could give her a call back.
I'll take care. Yep.
Okay, and in the meanwhile, remember that we have breakout rooms afterwards if anybody's interested. And if you don't join us, I wish you all just a wonderful holiday, a restful time to gather your thoughts. I hope you're able to see your families. And just before we go though, Michael Flower, you had something you wanted to show us. Have you got it right there? Oh, I'm sorry, Michael. Graham has cut us. Well, maybe he hasn't. Go ahead, Michael. Show us that picture you had there.
Well, there's a piece out of the food run out of Nelson's flagship. And it's a story which I probably don't have time today, but basically, this is a piece out of his flagship. In 1897, this flagship was moored off the coast in England as a tourist. But along came June and the storm, and all the ship broke up. So many people in Blackpool have pieces of this. It's almost like whiskey galore in that many people in Blackpool have pieces of the flagship all made into pieces of furniture. So this is out of the cabin of the Foudrund, which was Nelson's flagship in the Mediterranean.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. All right, with that, pipes out.